Hey, Reed. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Brent. Good to see you.
Yeah. The first episode was really enlightening for me. I learned a lot and I really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks for coming back again. For those who aren't aware, Reed, old-fashioned Marxist, tag or sorry, tag. God, I'm losing my brain this morning. Handle Socialist Legacy on X/Twitter. Oh, that's
That's
a
right.
great way to start. Um, so yeah, I'm very excited to talk to you because I think deeply believe that we should be talking to people who have different perspectives than we do, and it's something that we don't do nearly enough. And that first encounter with you really highlighted a lot of gaps in my knowledge. You're incredibly knowledgeable from a Marxist/socialist perspective, and that first encounter reminded me that I didn't sort of go very deep into sort of the foundations of Marxism and some of the things that maybe get hand waved away by some people that are in my circles, right? And so I wanted to take the time to go a little bit deeper because, man, I learned a lot last time, and I'm sure that there's a whole lot more to extract from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe if I could just say like something very quickly to maybe summarize so that I don't want to retread things that,
For sure.
I know I can tend to ramble on at great length sometimes. So I want to try to avoid that. But I would just say two things about this history. I think most people think about this history. Most of what they may know about it is primarily from the period of roughly, say, 1917, like the Russian Revolution, afterwards.
Hmm.
So, whether that's really existing socialism in the form of the former, of the Soviet Union when it existed, and whatever other examples you might want to point to, or the other forms of socialism that were present in the free world, so to speak,
Hmm.
um, as kind of if not oppositional to the official communist position, then at least sort of alternatives of one form or another. So there's like Trotskyism, which is, you know, sees the rise of Stalin as the counter revolution, right? But also doesn't renounce the Soviet Union as not socialism in some
Hmm.
sense. Well, first of all, I mean, just a point of clarification there from a kind of orthodox Marxist standpoint, or even really the old Stalinist standpoint, the Soviet Union wasn't socialism. It was working towards socialism or building the foundations of socialism, which would be something that would happen down the road, which is not like meant as a defense or whatever, so much as that was actually the perspective, at least originally. And there were other forms. Of course, there's like social democracy or democratic socialism as well, and very there's social anarchist forms of socialism and so on. So most people know about that history. They may know a little bit from the 19th century. I would say that the real history kind of comes to an end around 1917. It doesn't begin around 1917. So, without retreading all of that stuff, I think we went into some of the detail of what that history was last time. It's it's very obscure to people, and without knowing about that, it's really hard to, I think, make a lot of sense of what happened in the 20th century. And people will rightly look at what happened and say, well, that doesn't look like a good
Hmm.
idea, you know? And they'll also look at the people who, for whatever reason, for one reason or another, do embrace the history of socialism in the 20th century, or at least one form or another of it, as a positive thing that they want to carry forward. They will look at those people as not serious, as, essentially, either confused or crazy or having ill intentions or whatever. And then the other thing, the other point I wanted to make is that I think it's important to understand this history, whether or not you have any inclination towards like a socialist perspective. In fact, I would say the people inclined to embrace socialism are generally, um, I think they're usually embracing something that doesn't really correspond to the actual history, but corresponds to the failure of the original socialist project, movement,
Mhm.
idea. And they embrace that failure as if it's the goal, right? Which is, obviously kind of a perverse thing to do. They don't really know that they're doing that. They're confused. They really don't understand this history, in my opinion.
What do you mean right there? Because I
Hmm.
think I know what you mean, but I want you to expand on that point a little bit. How in what way have you seen those people who embrace what you call like the
Hmm.
failures of
Yeah,
20th century socialism, like maybe just, suss that out a little bit for me?
sure. Well, just to finish that point, and then I'll address that. You know, the I think it's important to understand this history regardless of what those people say, and even if you want to have nothing to do with them, because the failure of socialism was a monumental historical event, that really was the defining, uh, kind of defining condition, defining, it kind of laid the foundations of the world that we live in now. And if you want to understand why the world is the way it is, you need to understand that failure. And with all due respect to critics of socialism, I think they tend to fall into the very same sorts of confusion as the people they criticize. And for that reason, their criticisms don't actually get at the problem that led to this. So whether or not you want to embrace it, in fact, I would say, especially if you're critical of it, you should want to understand it. And so getting to your question, for the most part, and I'm painting with a broad brush here, obviously generalizations are kind of, a messy tool. You need to use them, but
They're useful.
they're useful, but they have limitations. So take this with a grain of salt. I do think it's generally true for the most part that people that, consider themselves socialists and embrace socialism or one form or another today, um, are deeply confused about it. And that confusion is reflected in what they advocate, and frankly, how they conduct themselves, how they behave these days. It's, obviously there's a sort of a kind of, you could say like a cultural, I don't know if culture is the right word, but there's a sort of, a kind of subcultural component to it, sort of like youthful rebellion against the status quo that has over since the 60s become increasingly more of like an infantile temper tantrum against the status quo as opposed to a
Mm.
rebellion. So what does that mean? Is that your question sort of like what do I mean by
Yeah, I'm kind of poking at what you're alluding to, which is like this memification of an individual who you would typically see yelling the loudest about
yeah,
socialism, right? And it bothers me, right? Because I think it does them a disservice. I think
yeah,
it does the good parts, because I do believe everything has got pros and cons. Everything's a trade-off, right? So I think your perspective has value, and I
mm,
think it almost diminishes the value and the what could be brought to the conversation by this type of individual that's kind of polluting the entire movement. Maybe it's just because they're so vocal, maybe it's because they're so memified, but I do see these people, right? And I think it makes it so easy to be dismissive of maybe some of the more prescient components of
yeah.
this that we could actually have a discussion about. So that always rubs me the wrong way, gets me a little irritated.
Well, let me start by saying this. So these days, you know, at least in like the United States and so on, um, the people that you're going to meet that are socialists are, they're probably people of like my generation or our generation. I think you might be a little older than me, but I think we're roughly
Yeah, I'm in my
like
40s.
around. Yeah, so you're a little bit older, but like roughly, probably around your age or younger, probably more my age or younger. I'm about 38. Millennials primarily, and Zoomers as well, and people that are like a little older than you, kind of like Gen X people. There's
Mm-hmm.
not like a whole lot of socialism in that generation in terms of like a pronounced presence in popular, in the mainstream.
For sure, and I think there's a reason for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's because my generation, I am Gen X. We grew up
Yeah.
with the whole, United States versus USSR. Like it was all in the culture. It was even in the Rocky movies. Like there was this clear divide, and it was seen that the Soviets and ergo socialism is bad, and that was just
Right.
sort of something that seeped into the consciousness of everyone who was alive at that time, or at least the majority of the people. I think that was a big driver.
Right. And another component of that is that there was something of a revival of interest in socialism, Marxism in the 60s, 60s and 70s among the boomer generation, the new left.
Mm-hmm.
So that became, I don't know about your own personal experience, but I've certainly, from what I've, people I've encountered, that generation really loomed large over the kind of Gen X generation, and specifically their kind of anticlimactic decline from their youthful radicalism into
Mm-hmm.
this sort of embrace of mainstream society in a kind of increasingly cynical and sort of hypocritical way. I think that left a bad taste in the mouths of maybe a lot of younger people that kind of came up and witnessed that. Whereas my generation, so the Gen X, I think there's a term for like Gen X politics, to the extent that there's something like a left wing politics amongst
Mm-hmm.
Gen X. It was more like a post politics or like an anti politics. There was definitely a revival of interest in like anarchism, but it
Mm.
wasn't even so much like the political anarchism of the old fashioned kind of political style anarchism. I mean, maybe more so on like say the libertarian side of things, but
For
in
sure.
terms of like the leftist socialist side of things, it was almost more of like a subcultural type of thing, like a cultural anarchism or things like that. And it was really more of a protest against the mainstream in that sense than a sort of political project of any kind. My the millennial generation, we came up, the defining event for us when we were growing up, or events were 9/11 obviously,
Mm-hmm.
and the Iraq War and the anti-war protests of the Bush administration era, which we were all we were kind of high school and college age around that time. So we were sort of learning from that process. A lot of the
Mm.
leaders of that those protests were kind of older 60s generation radicals, as well as some of the the limited number of kind of Gen X people that they sort of trained to be their sort of their inheritors or whatever. We came up under that, and then of course there was Obama and the financial crisis in 2008. So those were really kind of defining events. And so Marxism did get a bit of a revival during that anti-war period, in the form of like anti-war politics. So specifically like anti-imperialist politics.
Well, it did until Obama took office, right? And then you all packed up
It
your
did
shit and
until
went
Obama.
home.
Exactly, it did until Obama took office, right? So a lot of people in my generation were first exposed to Marxism in the context of like anti-imperialism,
Mm-hmm.
specifically anti-American imperialism,
Right, right.
and sometimes even just anti-Americanism. Just identifying America, the legacy of the United States, really the legacy of so-called Western civilization writ large, with everything wrong with the world, with this I don't think I need to elaborate on that point.
For sure, for
Probably.
sure.
And then yes, you're right. Like so, then that all came to a very sudden halt when Obama became the candidate, and especially when he was elected, after he was elected,
and immediately issued the Nobel Peace Prize.
Oh my God, remember that? I remember when Trump was elected for his first term. I think there was some talk about him also winning the Nobel Peace Prize, or at least being nominated for it. And I think there was even someone on the Nobel committee that was pushing for it, but that obviously didn't happen. But anyway, that would have been interesting. Especially when you compare their foreign administration's foreign policies.
For sure.
So anyway, to make a long story short, then you have like Occupy Wall Street and so on, and you have like about a decade, a little less than a decade under the Obama administration, where there was some interest in, well, what about socialism, right? We tried anarchism with Occupy Wall Street. Again, anarchism really not, like anarchism.
Yeah.
And, there was that whole anti-imperialism thing, but that really fell into the background. Maybe it shouldn't have. It's not like the war stopped. They just fell out of attention. But anyway, the economic situation was far more prominent, I think, for most people at that point.
It was, but I think that there was a convergence of topics where, and this is what really saddens me, because this goes back to the intro to this episode, is I feel like there was a missed opportunity, because you had I think what socialists do really well in a lot of ways is to highlight the problems in the system, right? And the 2008 financial crisis was a perfect opportunity. And I think you saw some people that were very much on the left and some people that were very much on the right that identified the same problems, that had this common sort of view of things. And I think that there was a moment in time with Occupy where we really could have moved together. We could have formed coalitions, and then it just devolved, right? It feels like it just went into this tribal space, and then we just missed a really important moment. And I'm trying to steer us back there, because I feel like we're politically in a very similar place where things are getting very, very dicey. The future is very uncertain. I mean, we're making movies in Hollywood now about a civil war in America. Like this is serious stuff. And instead of hunkering down in our corners, not talking to each other, and thinking that we're going to there's a bunch of beliefs about which way this is going to go, and I feel like we need to pull together and sort of identify problems together and talk about them and figure out a way forward, whether that be political, whether that be cultural, whether that be some other third option. But man, I really am sad about the 2008 financial crisis, because man, it was just teed up for us in such a way that we could have all rallied together, and we missed the moment.
Yes, and there really was no clear. So there was a period when, and I was in these circles. A lot of millennials, like, we were entering the job market at that point. And there was, it's a pretty well-known phenomenon at this point, the sort of declassing of the millennial, formerly upwardly mobile, millennial segment of the population. There had been like a massive expansion in higher education over the previous generations, going back to the GI Bill, but especially after the 60s. And, at a certain, we really reached a certain limit of the capacity of the job market to absorb those people, at least temporarily, which, was really forcefully, which was enforced with the crisis, contracting the job market and so on. Not to mention, that there was, well, okay, I don't want to go off on a tangent. I'm trying to stay a little bit disciplined, at least. So back to the main subject. So there was this expectation that Obama was going to do something. There were illusions in Obama, and those illusions were encouraged by the people that educated us, by professors and mentors in the movement and the activist, circles. There were still at that time a lot of very small and marginal, but nonetheless present and visible, and they were there, Marxist organizations of some sort, and many different sorts, like hundreds of different tendencies. Hundreds might be a slight exaggeration, but there were, a lot of them. that were around, these sorts of protest demonstrations. And they were around college campuses, and they were there. They were part of the education. Obviously, the internet wasn't quite as substantial of a phenomenon at that point. It was only kind of still becoming what it now is. So a lot of education was still interpersonal and actually it meant engaging people in the real world. And so, there was, a lot of education that pushed us in the same direction that the 60s generation went, and the same direction that the earlier old left generation went in the 30s. So the Great Depression period, which I won't retread the whole history, but just to give you a very brief summary, the Communist Party in the 1930s decided to throw all of their, and when I say the Communist Party decided, I mean the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union decided for the various communist parties in the world. So Stalin, essentially, and Stalin's sort of circles decided to orient these parties, and including the party, the Communist Party of the United States, to essentially subordinate themselves to the leading kind of liberal parties in the Western countries. So the Democratic Party in the United States, essentially because they didn't want to have any basis for a conflict in the lead up to World War II. They wanted, the Soviet Union did not want the Nazi Germany invading, and they wanted to ally with the West against that. And the West was not receptive to it. England, France did not want to ally with the Soviet Union. They also weren't exactly enthusiastic to ally with Hitler, but they were there was a period where they were kind of going back and forth, like, which of these evils do we align with against the other, right? Maybe Hitler will get rid of the communists, but then we have to deal with Hitler. And, some of them liked Hitler, some of them liked Mussolini. And of course, fascism in both of those forms were one way or another sort of degenerate offspring of the socialist movement. Anyway, what happened with the Communist Party is they ended up essentially supporting the Democratic Party, the Roosevelt administration, during that period. And, so what Marxism had always meant before that was the independent political organization of the working class, an independent working class party. And the whole goal of Marxism is not socialism or communism in the sense of, like, Marx has this system that he wants to impose upon society that everyone has to obey or something. In fact, that's what all the other socialists before Marx and alongside, as well, before and after Marx, that's what a lot of them, most of them, that's what essentially in one form or another, that's what they meant by socialism, some sort of ingenious system through which to organize society. And, when I was saying at the beginning, I think the criticism of socialism is really important. That's not like me speaking, against my own Marxism, but that's really my speaking as a Marxist, because Marx and Engels saw their role in the socialist movement as the critics of the movement from within. So they were critics of, especially of the ideas that circulated in the movement, but not just the ideas on their own terms, but what those ideas were reflecting. Like, why are these ideas appealing to people? What does that mean? What is the significance of these ideas? Because whatever you think of the ideas weren't really what was important to them. What was important to them was the fact that there was this radical social change going on, the Industrial Revolution. It's really the most profound transformation of human life since the Neolithic Revolution. Maybe more so. Arguably, probably more so. But it wasn't clear exactly what that change was going to lead to, right? There was a period from the beginning of the 19th century, at least up until the mid 19th century. Arguably, it goes at least until the turn of the 20th century. I would say it's still going on. I'd say we were still trying to figure out people are still talking about oh, automation's going to destroy jobs and so on. Well, guess what? They've been talking about this for 200 years. That was literally what motivated the original socialist movement. Was, what do we do about the fact that the machines are getting rid of the jobs, and now we have all these unemployed people looking for jobs that are becoming poor and alcoholics and criminals, and worse than that, they're organizing into unions and political parties and trying to take power and so on. We can deal with criminals, but revolutionaries is another story. So the whole point was to get the working class was not to get the working class in power. The whole point was that the working class were already trying to take power or to organize themselves into a party in England, in France, in the most developed countries in Europe. And so they were interested in the socialist ideas, but Marx's whole point was, look, these ideas reflect the problems that you're confronting in society, and they're the ways that you're trying to make sense of these problems and how they might be resolved. But those ideas can't tell you how to do that. They're only ways of thinking about things, and they're probably distorted ways of thinking about things. That doesn't mean you shouldn't consider them, but you should consider them critically, and especially look at, where are they coming from? Why do they appeal, etc. So the real point was not that socialism was something to be imposed through political power on society. That's what people think now, of course, and for good reason. And socialists themselves think this now and embrace that. But what Marx and Engels thought was, if the working class formed a political party and took power in the advanced capitalist countries, they would be forced to confront the fact that capitalism is already socializing production. It's already leading to this integrated social system of production. And they would have to do something about that, just like how the parties that presently control political power have to do something about that. And so they themselves look like versions of socialism of maybe a different kind. So I think you wanted to leap in there.
Well, no, I wanted to know what you meant exactly, right? Because I struggle with terminology because, like you, I'm a little bit wonky, particularly on the economic side. And when you say, socialized production, like I think I kind of get what you mean, but I want to make sure I completely understand, because I'm coming from a position where it's like we don't have capitalism right now. Like there's something akin to fascism. There's some corporatism. It's not capitalism as far as I define it, and so I wanted to understand what you meant when you said that the current system of production is more of something akin to socialism. I'm not entirely sure what you mean.
So I think we might have discussed this last time, but maybe I'll just quickly rehash this. So the term capitalism, is used in a way now. It's kind of started. It took on connotations in like roughly the 19 teens and 20s. That time frame not really being coincidental. That we now, if you look it up in the dictionary, that's kind of the definition you'll find in most places now, which is essentially it's commerce, it's trade, exchange of commodities, private ownership of property, exchange of the products of private owners, of private production, free enterprise, free markets, etc. It's that all that stuff, and that is really that's not what that term meant in the 19th century. I mean, you can go back and look at dictionaries from the 19th century. It's a very different definition, because they already had terms to refer to those things, and that's not what socialism was opposed to. In fact, most of the socialists embraced one form or another of what we would now think of as capitalism in that sense. In other words, really truly free markets. That was the dominant current of socialism before Marxism, at least on the continent in Europe, was the tendency most famously represented by a guy named Proudhon, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. And his vision was essentially something, and he was not the only one, but his was very prominent, was, essentially small scale production in which everyone was an owner of the means of employing themselves in one form or another, whether as an individual or, cooperatives or what have you. And in which exchange was the fair exchange of equal values amongst equal people. Not equal in the sense of owning equal amounts of stuff, but in the sense of having an equal status, everyone having the same rights as everyone else, the same, so another idea that nowadays gets associated with socialism is like equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. That was so before socialism emerged, there was already this kind of concern with the poor, which came out of the Christian tradition, but there was a kind of a secularized form of it emerging, like philanthropism, what we would now think of as like secular charity as opposed to religious charity. And so that was really more about like not necessarily equal outcomes, but equalizing the outcomes, sort of leveling the playing field in some form. And eventually you'd have like politics emerging, trying to redistribute the wealth, another idea that people associate with Marxism, that Marx and Engels never affirmed anything like that, and they opposed it, actually. So socialists like Proudhon, for example, were really more gunning for a genuine equality of opportunity that was being deprived of people, that was being deprived of common people by the people that monopolized the wealth of society. And so that was generally associated with political power. The monopoly on wealth that was made possible by the monopoly on political power by the ruling class, the old ruling class primarily. So the remnants of the old aristocracy and the bureaucracy, the state bureaucracy that was kind of part of that class. Now the state in the 19th century kind of underwent some changes. Now I feel like we're going to kind of drift a little bit back towards stuff we might have already covered, but let me try to answer your question directly. So socialization of production. So capitalism for Marx and Engels, that concept goes back. They didn't invent it, but it was coined by another socialist, a French socialist named Louis Blanc. The idea was sort of already around, but it hadn't really been formalized with a term. Now, the idea of capital existed, and the idea of capitalists existed. So capital is just wealth that you use. So it's essentially, to put it crudely, it's money that you use to make more money.
Correct.
Right? It's accumulating wealth by means of wealth. Property that kind of reproduces itself, essentially. And so the idea with that was, so the old landowners, the old nobility, they were still, kind of there. They weren't what they were, but the remnants of that world still existed in Europe, especially in southern and Eastern Europe. And so they essentially saw this newly emerging industrial society on the model of the old form of class rule. So there were lords of the land that everyone else was essentially their slaves because they monopolized the means of life, the means of production, the land that everyone else depended upon. And so they, exploited them through rents and through taxes and through tithes and through, whatever else, and now you had this newly not so new. You had rising to prominence a new ruling element, which were the money lords as opposed to the landlords. So the landlords monopolized the land, the money lords monopolized the money, and everyone depended on money because society had become a society of commodity producers and exchangers. And if you couldn't get money, you couldn't buy things, and if other people couldn't get money, you couldn't sell things. Right? And money in those days was a thing that was hard to find. It was not paper that you could print. It was gold. It was silver. It was a real substantial thing. And it was not something that was easy to acquire. And the people that did acquire it did not let it go easily. They, in fact, used it to acquire more and more at a much faster rate than anyone else could. So then you have this rise of industrialism. And so then you start to see these manufacturing, these manufacturers that are becoming these sort of, that are sort of controlling these increasingly titanic accumulations of property in the form of massive factories with these integrated automated systems of machinery that were also interconnected through these increasingly expansive systems of coordinated distribution, whether in one enterprise or in separate enterprises. You had stock companies reemerge. So, this old remnant of like mercantilism kind of comes back in a new form and replaces the sort of the sole proprietorship or the partnership as the dominant form of ownership increasingly. And so that's kind of like a kind of collectivized form of ownership of this stuff by not all of society so much as a minority that really monopolizes the ownership of that property. And but more importantly than that, though, is the flip side of what's going on. So Proudhon and a lot of the other socialists, they see all this stuff happening, all that stuff I just described, and they say, well, so you had these people monopolizing the land, and then you had these people monopolizing money, and now you have these people monopolizing factories and capital goods, and so on. And what we want is to break things up and have it so that everyone can have their own and be free to interact with each other as individuals, as opposed to the majority of people being essentially reduced to like serfs or slaves, dependent on this minority that controlled what they needed to live, and therefore subjugated them, not as direct servants of not like subject to personal servitude, but this kind of impersonal servitude where the slaves have to find a master to enslave them or they'll starve, right? So that was how it was understood by most socialists, and not just socialists. This was kind of a liberal idea. This was a sort of philanthropic liberal idea. And then there were also like the more hardcore radical liberals, the kind of precursors of modern libertarianism, who were not indifferent to these circumstances, but they saw the problem as the inadequate development of commerce and industry that was being restrained by political power. So in a sense, they saw the same problem as the socialists, but they saw the solution as almost the opposite in a way. It's a bit complicated. It's so I want to kind of move on from that.
I understand what you're talking about, and I think that we've touched on it several times in this episode so far, and I wanted to pivot a little bit to that tweet that you sent me, the video posted by John Russell, which, by the way, fantastic. It was he essentially went out to a Oliver Anthony concert and talked to people who I think probably had what you would expect to have a different viewpoint as he does, and found out that, hey, well, there's actually a lot of commonality here. And I think your tweet, you said it's so painfully obvious that the potential exists for a mass proletarian party, and yet socialists, quote unquote, deny it because they're just hysterical Democrats. They want to help people they consider victims because what they really want is position the bureaucratic stratum of the ruling class. I mean, that was a great intro, response to that video. But I think that video really highlighted what I was talking about, similar to like OH, right? Like I think there's a lot of people, whether that be the most rural red portion of America and the most far left person you could find in the inner city somewhere, we're sort of seeing the same problems, and people are looking for solutions. And I wanted to sort of get your take on what you think you can bring, because you're great with the history and all that stuff. I love that stuff. But what I'm always trying to do is look forward. Like, how do we synthesize the salient points here? How can we distill something down into something actionable, like something we could all rally around and sort of move the world forward? And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, because I think you probably have quite a few.
Yeah. So on that, just directly on that point, I agree. I mean, I'm as interested as I am in the history, I would much rather be dealing with present day reality. But actually, a kind of core element of Marxist perspective is that our inability to deal with the present is because we're kind of burdened with the weight of the past in a way that we haven't thoroughly kind of worked through. We haven't really come to grips with what has happened to lead to the present, and so we end up there's that that quip by, I think, is it Lord Acton maybe, that it's Santayana. So I can't remember who said it, but it's a famous saying that those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it, right?
Yep.
And that's, in a sense, essentially, it's a little oversimplifying, but that is in essence kind of Marx's point, is that we're essentially repeating the very process that created the problem we're dealing with. And so all we end up doing in trying to resolve this problem is expand the scale at which it manifests. So it just, we're making the problem bigger. And so that for a time, it's less immediately pressing, but it ends up becoming all the more of a kind of immense problem the more we do this, right? The more this happens. And this process has been repeating itself over and over for a few centuries now. It was like half a century or so, a little more than half a century in Marx's time, when but it was going on since the Industrial Revolution began in the late 18th century, really. And so I do want to just briefly finish that previous point, because I didn't really answer your question exactly. I kind of talked about what the other socialists saw in capitalism. It's this they're seeing it as essentially the repetition of the past. It's these new lords, right, and new slaves. And people still do this today, the techno-feudalism, right, that people talk about that. They were talking about the same essential idea in the 19th century. They didn't have quite the same technology, obviously, but it was in essence the same in terms of its economic role anyway. So the socialization really is not so much about that as it is about the changed character of the production process itself. And not just the production process in the sense of like the process of producing material goods, but the entire system by which we produce all of the things that all of the different production processes use to produce all of the things that all of the people need to consume to live. And not just consume in the sense of like food, but all the things they use in all of the aspects of their existence, all the elements of life. So the socialization is, on the one hand, the expansion of production from production by small scale producers. So essentially not individuals, not isolated individuals, but, families, small units, small craftsmen with small workshops, small farms, etc. Small scale production with limited capacity to expand, to develop, to technologically develop, to expand its productivity in any manner. And for that matter, in most of the production was not production of commodities at all. It was agricultural production in the form of direct subsistence production by peasants, who would, maybe engage in exchange of whatever surplus they're able to produce, if they're able to produce a surplus. But peasants often were not able to even produce enough to eat. That's why they were always in debt, because they had to go get loans because they couldn't afford, because their land was too poor to produce sufficiently to support even their families. So that was, the wealthier parts of the peasantry were able to kind of ply that into, the ability to expand. But, for the most part, they weren't. And so that all comes to a very rapid end between the 14th century and the 16th century in Europe, in Western Europe in particular. And that's the rise of the market, of the commercial world that we know today, as obviously markets always existed, but that was when the market, the world market, became the dominant mode in which people related to one another in terms of acquiring their means of life. So progressively, people are no longer small-scale agricultural producers, but agriculture is being undertaken by large capitalist farms that employ wage laborers in their production processes, which are way, way, way more productive than any peasant could ever dream of being. And they generate way more wealth, and they radically transform the countryside, which leads to a mass loss of a mass kind of exodus of the peasant, or sometimes an exodus, sometimes they were forced off the land by its actual owners, since they were only they only had a title to to use it.
And a flight to urban areas too. I think that's what you see as a migration of these folks who were doing these family farms in the past, and it sort of allowed the cities to sort of explode because the productive capacity of these smaller, more productive, farms and agricultural operations was able to sustain the cities.
So you have a ton of people looking for work that are now being hired to work in workshops where they're working with large numbers of people, as opposed to a few skilled craftsmen, who are all employed by a kind of centralized authority. It's not like the brotherhood of the guild. It's an employer. I'm abbreviating this process. It's more complicated than this, but essentially, there's large scale cooperation of people that are employed as wage laborers.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes the basis of production. And not only that, they're producing obviously commodities, and they're receiving money, which means that money then goes onto the market as demand for commodities. That stimulates that production process and a feedback loop that transforms the entire world radically over the course of 2 centuries or so. And so the production process, then you have large scale cooperation, which then leads to the development of an increasingly complex division of labor within the production process. Adam Smith talks about this in The Wealth of Nations, famously, the pin factory, which that in and of itself, so cooperation radically expands the productivity of labor on its own, just having a group of people in one place producing together. Then when you implement division of labor, that takes it to such an even more radical level that it dramatically changes things very quickly. So essentially, from the late 17th to the mid 18th century, around the time of the American Revolution. And then very rapidly after that, you start having the division of labor itself, which kind of reduces people from skilled craftsmen to people performing mechanical operations in concert with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then it starts replacing those people with machines that can perform those mechanical operations far more effectively and far more efficiently, far more cheaply, and that obviously then explodes, and that's where the Industrial Revolution comes in. So all of what I just described is the development of an increasingly socialized production process, in the sense that it's not production by individuals for their own immediate needs, nor is it production by individuals of commodities for exchange. It's production of commodities for exchange by social organizations, associations of people on increasingly larger scales that are increasingly integrated with one another through systematic relations of exchange. So it's not like, oh, you just happen to go to the market and buy something. It's a regular relationship of interchange between established, clients and patrons and so on. And obviously those are then integrated into concerns that horizontally integrate or vertically integrate, absorb their competition or absorb their, the producers of their inputs and so on. So the market kind of facilitates this integration of the production process that radically expands the productivity of labor. It radically stimulates the development of science and technology as well, because it gives a motive for that in the form of their application to industry and to society more generally. So okay, now that all of that is kind of what I wanted to say with respect to the socialization of production. And so that's happening. That's just happening. And it's been happening, and it's still happening, and it's not slowing down. It's becoming, like I said, like we're still talking about automation. We're still, and now it's like automation of intelligence, supposedly. Although, what has intelligence been reduced to, if that's the case?
For sure. And then think about Elon's latest PR event. You're gonna have automatons, some robots that will be able to reproduce themselves, right? So have some sort of intelligence and be able to produce things themselves. And I'm assuming from a socialist standpoint, that's very concerning.
For most of the socialists, yes. But the thing about that is, what happens to the people who are rendered redundant by automation, right? So obviously, the normal response you'll get from anyone with a kind of an economic education in like modern economics, neoclassical economics and so on, is, well, it may render some labor redundant, but it also leads to the expansion of other aspects of the of industry. It leads to new industries arising.
Mhm.
It creates new needs, new demands that then give rise to new opportunities for employment, which is true. Although it doesn't necessarily happen in such a way that everyone that gets rendered redundant then immediately just gets reabsorbed,
Sure,
right?
sure.
So there's obviously some room for contestation there. But there's also a further problem, which is that this expansive tendency, certainly throughout the 19th century and at least until the 30s, although I'd say, it's pretty hard to dispute that this has not actually been suppressed as people thought for a while in the 20th century, but still is happening. This expansive capacity of production reaches a point where it overwhelms the ability of the market to absorb its product, and then you have bankruptcies, you have businesses going under, you have people becoming unemployed, which itself produces a negative feedback loop, not a negative feedback loop in the technical sense, but a bad feedback loop that leads to large-scale collapses of industry. And so sometimes socialists will then say, well, see, capitalism, leads to its own it leads to its own collapse, or, whatever. But the thing is, when that happens, that just creates a new opportunity for investment. That just allows people that are able to maintain their position, their wealth in the midst of crises, to absorb the wealth of their competitors and to concentrate and centralize the wealth that is now freed up. And of course, there's also still opportunities for new industries to arise and so on. It's not as if it's all just centralized, but the core industries are increasingly centralized and still centralizing and integrating themselves with each other, with the financial system that kind of connects all of these things together, and with the state, which is essentially the armed wing of the financial system.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is sort of the problem that capitalism poses to society. But Marx doesn't see that as like a bad system that it's immoral or just impractical or whatever. He sees it as a process of evolution. It's a process of social development, the historical development of society, that's creating the conditions for a higher form of society. And, all of history has proceeded through these sorts of processes of like conflicts and contradictions and
Mm-hmm.
antagonisms, that people have to confront problems, work through them, overcome them, and thereby not just go beyond the problem, but achieve a kind of more profound level of existence than they had beforehand. They resolve the old problems not simply by going back to what was the case before, but by establishing something even greater than existed before. So the obstacle becomes the means of going beyond what had existed before. It's not simply an obstacle to keeping things the way they already were, right?
Got it.
So my summary would be the problem with capitalism for the old-fashioned Marxist tradition, the original kind of classical Marxism, was that it's not that capitalism is a problem, it's that it's a process of transformation of society that society is rebelling against, in the sense that it's trying to constrain this development within the old framework that has become increasingly too narrow to contain it. And so it keeps bursting through these narrow constraints, but then society keeps reimposing these narrow constraints on it. And so the state is the most obvious way it does that, because the state is quite literally the means by which we try to forcibly constrain society within the old framework, literally by force, within literally the old laws. And we may modify the laws, but we do that in a way that preserves things essentially the way they were, the way that if you keep patching an old pair of jeans, eventually it'll be more patches than jeans.
Right.
Okay, so now that I've elaborated all that, you can go ahead
I agree
and get
with
me
you,
back
by
on
the
track.
way. No, I completely agree with you. I think we're tracking 100%. I think the state is ultimately the problem. If you understand the nature of the state, I think most folks don't. I think most folks view the state as just their physics. This is, you could never live without a state. This is required. I disagree, but I also don't. I'm not flippant about the desire I have to overturn the state, right? To live in a world without a state. Um, The older I get, the more people I interact with, the more I realize that people generally just want to be taken care of. They don't want to have any responsibility. They don't want to, deal with a world without some sort of naive view of this benevolent Santa Claus figure called the state that takes care of people, and the world would just rip apart without it, right? And so I'm a little bit getting frustrated with that. And so I know we wanted to talk about the election.
Well,
Oh, good.
well, so I mean, you mentioned that video, and I kind of brushed it aside just because I was, I went a little overboard, maybe getting back to the earlier point, but there is something really important. So that video is great, and we don't have to go into too much detail, but one thing I did want to raise about it. So you mentioned the Oliver Anthony performance,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we all probably remember when that song came out and it made such a big stir. I remember the first time I listened to it, and it is a great song. It's a very, it's a gripping song. It's really like grips you from that first, line. And I'm sure most leftists had this experience. Well, at least most. So leftist is a complicated term, but let's assume
Sure.
let's assume it's people that are vaguely in my ballpark, right? More or less, not these kind of insane racist Democrat psychopaths or whatever. I'm sure most of them had this experience where they listened to the first verse and they were like so into it, and they were like, "This is awesome." And then that line about welfare comes in, and they're like, "This guy's a fascist," blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Right? Because what they want, what socialists think socialism means, what they desire from socialism, like what they're seeking in being socialists, is an expanded welfare state, which was, I had mentioned there was like the philanthropic sort of tendency, and that socialism distinguished itself from that early on. But there was always some proximity there, especially in the kind of more middle class forms of socialism in the 19th century. And there was also a reactionary kind of socialism. Reactionary meaning, in the old fashioned sense, so essentially it meant people that wanted the old forms of authority to come back or to be preserved. And that meant, the old ruling classes, the old traditions, and that could mean anything. But generally, it always meant the state. It meant essentially some sort of bureaucratic system that codified and solidified what had been less formalized forms of authority in the past, because it was a less intensely, bureaucratized kind of society. The bureaucracy existed, but it was much quainter than what we have now. But it comes back, and there is this reactionary kind of socialism that Marx and Engels are viciously critical of, and frankly, even in his first article that he even mentions communism, he's warning about this. That what then would later become known as state socialism, which the Marxists opposed. Now, there was also Bakunin and the anarchist who accused Marx of being a state socialist, and that confuses people because they think Marx was one of the state socialists, but Marx was also criticizing the same state socialists that were identified with Marxists. So it's a complicated story. Maybe we could go into the details another time. But the point of it is that socialism was not about getting welfare. In fact, welfare was essentially, in its modern form, invented as a means of combating the influence of the Socialist Party in Germany by Otto von Bismarck. And then that was exported to the United States and other places. And, the essential idea basically being that the state would prevent this, it would essentially buy off the working class, it would essentially bribe them by providing them with the things that they seemingly wanted. But the thing is, what the working class movement wanted was to provide these things for themselves. They didn't want these things to be given to them. So they wanted insurance for unemployment, for retirement, for etc. They weren't seeking that as a handout. They were seeking that as, essentially what they wanted was more money, and not money from the government. They wanted more money for their work, right? They wanted to bargain for a higher, share of the product than they were getting, so that they could provide better for themselves. That was essentially the whole goal, but that was kind of the kernel of it, right? Was
Right.
they wanted a bigger share because they felt they were, more, they didn't just feel, they were important. But the thing is, they were only important if they were working together. And that's the case both when they were employed. So when they're working in the factory, one worker is worthless. It's only when they're all working together that they're actually producing something, right? So it's not like they're individual producers. They're only producers when they're working together. And that means when they're working for a capitalist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or a cooperative factory, which existed. They were very marginal, but they were important for the movement. That was their vision, was a society of cooperative ownership of the means of production. And that could take different forms. There were different visions of that. But it wasn't, and, of course you provide for people that can't work, people that are unable to work like legitimately, but you don't create this society of people that are just adapted to being worthless. It's absurd. It's just so absurd that would have anything to do with this movement of working men that wanted to provide for themselves. It just has nothing to do with it. But it became what socialism means for complicated reasons. And so now that's what the left thinks socialism is. They think it's welfare. And they think that, well, the working class, they want welfare. And the workers that don't want welfare, well, they're bad. They're racists. They only want stuff for their own race or what, like,
Right,
insane stuff that people think, So when that part of the song comes in, people on the left were like, they tuned out and they became hostile to it. But one of the great things about that video, there's a lot of great things about that video, is that the host is interviewing people at this concert, working class people that are fans of Anthony, and I think he either talks to Anthony or he plays a clip of him being interviewed as well, where he basically says, look, essentially what they're upset about with the welfare thing is not people not going hungry, it's that they don't want these people to be bribed by the people in power and used against hardworking people. They don't want the state to buy off a section of the working class and use it against the rest of the working class, which was always a concern. So that's kind of, one thing for me that I thought was really powerful in that video was it was never about blaming poor people.
Yeah. And that's the other thing too. I think it's an often overlooked aspect of that lyric. Is at least the way I've read it, and I've talked to other people who've had similar view on it, is that this is this is a critique of the welfare system, right? So if you know anything about the way food stamps work, and like, you can go into any grocery store and you can get essentially anything, and there's a lot of this hyper ultra palatable processed foods that are really hurting people, right? It's the cheapest form of calories, and so we have a lot of undernourished obese people that have really bad health problems. It's not doing them any favors through that whole process.
Low quality calories.
Yeah, and it's like, if you know anything about where welfare dollars end up, they just end up in the corporation's pockets, right? Yeah. So you've got, a subsidization of the workforce where you can offer them low wages, knowing that they can receive state assistance via food stamps and via Medicaid and other things, as sort of an offloading of what they normally should be providing as a benefits and salary package to employees. You can offload that to the state, and the state says, okay, cool, we're going to give you this assistance that you're going to go right back to Walmart, which, by the way, is the number one recipient of welfare aid, right? It just goes right back in the corporation's pockets, and the people that are stuck in that system end up, sick and unhealthy and a bunch of medical issues, and the drain on the system through that. And so I think a lot of people took that away, as opposed to like, screw you, you shouldn't get my welfare dollars, right?
No, exactly. And so this is where the millennial left hit their dead end, really. I mean, I think there was some potential, but let's be clear what we're talking about here. We're talking about essentially these children of middle class families, and middle class is kind of an ambiguous term that can embrace anything from sort of relatively the kind of upper levels of the working class, people that by the working class, I mean like specifically people that are employees, right?
Right.
People that are employed by someone else as opposed to employing themselves. But, also there's middle class in the sense of self-employed people.
Sure.
And small business, although most of what gets called small business is really self-employment, in the sense that they're not employing other people, or they're only employing a few other people. They're not employing more than 20 people, let alone 50 or 100 or thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. So it could be like working people in that sense. And then, of course, there's also like middle managers, like corporate bureaucratic people. And there's professionals that are kind of somewhere, depending on what they do and where they work and what field they're in, they're somewhere between being self-employed or being employees or being like bureaucrats. There's like, it's a little complicated, like, and we don't need to like draw distinctions here, but the main point is that these are people that were aspiring to more than a kind of average working class life, let's say, right? More than like earning like the average wage,
Right.
And that we're, hoping to kind of go somewhere in life, that got an education, for the most part, and then saw their prospects in life disappear before them. And so when they were politicized and when they looked to Obama, they had this older generation in their ear that had basically taught them that the Democrats are our party, and they're not our party in the sense that they're not great, we don't really like them, but they're better than the Republicans, who are evil and fascists and whatever. For some reason, it really all goes back to the reason it really all goes back to is that Stalin said that was the party that the communists should support. I'm serious.
Right.
I'm so serious, because before that, in 1935, there was this sharp turn from, they were calling Roosevelt a fascist. The communists opposed Roosevelt, opposed the New Deal as fascism in the United States. And then literally overnight, they get a radio transmission from Moscow that says, we're supporting, you will now be supporting Roosevelt. And they did, so that happened in the New Left generation as well. They obviously they had their 1968 moment, which, even though it was like the protest of the DNC, the protest of Hubert Humphrey and all that, it was them kind of, they knew that they'd already kind of made their bed, right? Like they were in there already, and that's why they were protesting it, because that was their party now, And then 72, the McGovern debacle and all that, that really sealed the deal, and that's what they've been ever since. And so that's what the millennials ended up doing too. They were like, well, maybe Obama will meet this financial crisis by being a new FDR or a new LBJ. Maybe he'll create a new Great Society or a new Deal, a Green New Deal. That's when that stuff all came about. And of course, he didn't really do anything like that, but he did. I mean, he did in a way, just not. He didn't need to do any of the kinds of stuff that like Roosevelt maybe needed to do in terms of what he needed to do for his own, interests or whatever.
Right.
But what did really Obama do? Well, not really. I mean, who can really say what he did other than like the drone bombings and like the deportations and whatever? I mean, I don't know. I can't really remember. Oh, Obamacare, and what the heck was Obamacare? I don't know.
Just a giveaway to insurance companies.
A giveaway,
how I saw it.
Yeah. Like, I think someone, I heard it. It might have been like a Trump spokesperson or something. It might have been Trump himself. I can't remember. The other day said something like, "Oh yeah, Obamacare. Yeah, I still have that bronze plan where I pay out the ass and I literally am not allowed to see a doctor or whatever." Like it's like, yeah. So that was what they ended up fighting for, was Obama. And what was happening around that time, when Obama was first elected and throughout his first term and second term, the Republicans were calling him a socialist over and over. They kept calling him a socialist. And that's when the millennials started calling themselves socialists, really. They started calling themselves socialists because they wanted Obama to be their hero. And he was not. But they held on to that illusion. And so then what happened in 2016? Bernie Sanders came around and he said, look, I'll be everything that Obama wasn't, that you thought he was going to be. And what did Bernie Sanders do? He just closed the coffin lid on them, and now they're in there forever, They're Democrats now forever. It's a done deal. And then the Zoomers come along and they just become these psychopathic Stalinists because they're like like on Twitter or whatever. I don't know if there's anything in real life, but they want to be even more radically crazed with their leftism than the millennials were,
right?
Because they're kind of rebelling against it, but also everything's been reduced to sort of a substanceless spectacle at this point. So
Yeah. So what do you see looking forward? I wanted to ask you about the election. How do you see everything playing out, man? Like this is an interesting one.
I mean, I at this point I think it's probably uh it's Trump seems like he's probably going to win. I mean, you
Boy,
know.
it feels that way to me, right? Like from looking at all of the telltale signs, it feels like that's the way it's going. But also, I was watching Eric Weinstein's interview with Chris Williamson, talking about I don't know if they're going to let Trump win. With the and I'm
Yeah.
starting to wonder about that too. I am getting a little bit worried about this country, and because I feel like if there is any sort of legitimate shenanigans around this election, the whole country could rip apart. I feel like we're at a very, very
Yeah.
sharp inflection point potentially. I'm a little bit nervous.
It's ironic that between Bernie was the carrot and Trump was the stick that drove the
Right, right.
millennials into the Democratic Party for good, once and for all. But Trump was never what the left thought he was ever. I really, I mean, I don't know what you think, but I personally look. I don't really have much in common with Trump politically at all, but
Same.
I do appreciate at least. I like. I mean, I think he's pretty funny. I think he's entertaining.
That much
Is
is
he a
for
good?
sure.
Was he a good president, or will he be a good president? I don't really think that question has a whole lot of meaning, because at the end of the day, what is the president really able to do? Not a whole lot. I mean, he can do stuff. What he can do are within parameters that are already fixed, right?
Yeah, but I think and I agree. Like, if particularly if you look at the executive branch, the way it was intended to be, it was supposed to be very weak.
Right.
I think over time, it's continued to expand and become more powerful. And when you
Right.
get to like looking back at Trump's first term, I didn't see him vetoing any of these spending measures. Like this is wild to me. Printed $6.2 trillion out of thin air in just March of 2020 alone, a single month. And looking back from George Washington until the beginning of Barack Obama's term, there was only 4.5 trillion of debt ever accumulated.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, putting that into perspective and having him be like, actually, the only time he threatened to veto a spending bill was because it wasn't big enough during the pandemic. And if you know anything about the way, I know you do, the way those bills were set up, it was all just giveaways to corporations and moneyed interests, right? This was all PPP loans, and this was all direct funding to Pfizer and Moderna and the whole pharmaceutical complex, which was shocking to me to see the people who I considered allies in that particular fight, right? So the left has been typically very skeptical of big pharma, and then just instantly, overnight, they became the biggest supporters of big pharma and these corporations. And I was like, what in the fuck is happening?
Well, this is why this is what I mean when I'm talking about these socialists being, they're just, all they are is Democrats. Like, they will literally do whatever the Democratic Party says. And, that doesn't mean there aren't at least a minority, sometimes more than, sometimes a more substantial minority than other times, that will make their dissatisfaction known, like with the protests about the Israel Palestine conflict and so on. But really, what are they doing? All they're doing is complaining that the people that they already, they know that these people represent them, and they're just not happy about how they're being represented. So they're making a stink about it. But what does it really amount to? There's not really anything substantive politically behind it, in my opinion. I mean, I'm sure there are a decent number of people that are genuinely protesting a war because they don't want us to be involved in a war. But a lot of them, it's much more aesthetically charged, and it's much more about assaulting someone that represents the bad guys than it is,
It's tribalism.
Yeah,
it's tribalism.
Yeah, it's exactly, and it doesn't really have political content. It's like an aesthetic content, or what have you. It's about a group, signifying your group belonging.
Yeah, signaling. It's just a tribal affiliation
Yeah.
signals. That's all this stuff is.
So they'll just follow the Democrats at the drop of a hat, and it's very abject. It's kind of horrible. And there is something I see all the time that I watch a lot of, like, sort of, you might call it right-wing media, but I don't personally, some of it is maybe explicitly right wing. This is something we can maybe talk about another time, is like right and left and like those terms.
What does
That
that
whole
mean
thing, what
anymore?
does that even mean? Does it mean anything anymore? It doesn't really. Um, but really what I mean by that is like more Republican affiliated media, obviously.
Right.
I would say the Republican Party has always been the left-wing party in a historical uh, sense in the United States, as compared to the Democratic Party, which has always been the right-wing party. But that's something we could maybe discuss another time. It's a kind of a big subject. But I watch a lot of this stuff, and there's a tendency, and it's especially prominent these days, to essentially say, well, Democrats, especially like the worst of the Democrats, are really secretly, or maybe not even secretly, socialists, Marxists, communists. They have this agenda. They want to impose
Communist Kamala.
communism, right? Yeah, or Commie Harris. I've heard people say
Yeah.
Commie Harris, and it's like I get what they mean by that, and that's whatever. But what I would say is rather it's the other way around. That what it is that the socialists, the communists, the Marxists are Democrats. It's not that the Democrats are socialists and Marxists and
Right.
all that. And if they are, then they are in the same sense as those people, as the my contemporaries are, which is like in a effectively meaningless sense, where at best what it means is this sort of very vague gesture towards a history that they don't understand, and at worst it doesn't have any connection at all, and its whole content is like this truly insane and sinister identity politics nonsense that just is so wretched and putrid, and I have endless contempt for it. But that's like you know so that's what I would say about them. In terms of Trump, I don't really, like, look, I don't like support Trump or anything like that. I would rather Trump get elected, though. And
Mm.
the reason isn't because I think he would be a good, president or anything like that for reasons I was just mentioning. Um, and like you said about like the expansion of the money supply, for example.
Hmm.
Yeah, but that's been the pattern since Nixon. That's like
Yeah.
there's been a bipartisan policy of aggressive inflation, aggressively inflationary monetary policy, for 50, 60 years now. And we could talk about why that is, but that's just the way
Bretton
that
Woods
business is
Accord.
done now. And could Trump oppose that if he wanted to? I don't think he could. Would he oppose it? I don't know, probably not, but I don't
No.
know. Could it be replaced with something else, or could it be superseded? Yeah, but it would involve a pretty radical change. I mean,
Well, I think there's only one way it can change is by default. The United States defaulting on its debt, which I think
which
is
would
the
which would
mathematical,
be
like almost certainty, right? Like you can't.
right.
To the sort of
No,
naive
definitely.
Republican view is that, we can limit government, we can shrink government, we can balance the budget. It's like, bitch, no, you can't. Like, if you know anything about mathematics, there is no way with the current spending trajectory to do it.
Right.
We are already soft defaulting. That's what inflation is. You're defaulting by inflating the currency, and then eventually that's just going to end up in actual hard defaults. You're going to have to restructure. Like, the question is, and this is why I'm talking to you, is like, what do we do next? Because I think
Well,
we see something bad's coming, and we would, in a perfect world, prepare for it and think about charting a new course to something better. Otherwise, it's just going to be hell.
I'm not so worried about that, at least not in the short term. And, who am I? I'm not like some expert on geopolitics or whatever. I'm probably more well informed than a lot of people, but I'm certainly no expert. Um, you know, but my own sense of it, at least for whatever that's worth, is I'm not super concerned about that, because I mean, what we would be talking about with the U.S. defaulting on its debt would be World War III, and it wouldn't be World War III in a way that is like really analogous to World War I or II. It would be really something much more radically, even more radical than those events, which were probably the most radically, catastrophic. People at the time of World War I thought it really was like the end of the world.
Right.
And so could that happen? It definitely could. But look, it would bring like most of the world down with it, at least temporarily. it would be a suicidal gesture, for there to be a mounting opposition to the dollar as the reserve currency. I mean, it would really create a huge conflict, and how wouldn't necessarily culminate in a military conflict, but if it didn't, I don't think it would take the form of the US just being kind of gradually phased out of its role as the world hegemon. I think it would be that role remains in place and just changes in some ways, but let me say why I think that, because there's this idea that empires rise and fall, right? There's been a pattern of empires rising and fall throughout history, and every empire that rises will eventually fall. And sure, maybe that's true, but the pattern of civilization since the modern era began, so say since the 16th century, and really more than that since the 19th century, since the Industrial Revolution, but you could trace it back, all the way to the Columbian Expedition and the Protestant Reformation and, all these sorts of events, the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all this stuff, the Enlightenment, Scientific Revolution, etc. It is all kind of one process, but the Industrial Revolution is sort of like the exclamation point that, announces, full-throatedly what this was all about,
Mm-hmm.
And, that process didn't really involve the rise and fall of the empires that it led to itself, right? So there was Spain, there was Portugal. They weren't really bourgeois. They weren't capitalist. They were, in a more antiquarian sense, like a kind of mercantile sort of capitalist, a sort of extractive capitalism, a sort of slave capitalism, slave exploitation. But that doesn't unlock the power of social production. That doesn't unlock the power of cooperation, of technology, of free association of individuals, commerce, because slaves aren't participating in that. They're just reduced to beasts of burden or machines, like
Mm-hmm.
directly, as opposed to wage laborers who are only reduced to machines for 8 hours a day or so, depending on
Right.
how long your workday is. That, Spain, Portugal, etc., they collapsed, but they were remnants of the medieval era, really. So then you have the Dutch Republic, which, did it fall? Well, it stopped being the most powerful, commercial, empire, commercial power in the world, on the world market. But did it? Because what really happened was that their revolution, the Dutch revolt, against the Spanish Netherlands, that kind of leads to the independence of the Dutch Republic and leads to their commercial supremacy for a time, triggers the English Revolution, which is, they're separate countries, but they're really interconnected. The economies, the societies, they're deeply interconnected. And of course, in the culmination of the English Revolution, they put a Dutchman on the throne.
Mm-hmm.
So, and of course, they're fighting wars with each other, but they're like commercial wars. They're wars for commercial supremacy. And it's really more a matter of like establishing the commercial empire that's still kind of emerging. The Dutch, as much as they were the kind of first to do it, it was still pretty primitive. It was still more about, it was still mercantile in the sense that it was more about generating wealth by buying cheap and selling dear than it was about increasing the productivity of the production process and reaping the difference between the cost and the product that you generate through that increase.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really about directly increasing productivity. That doesn't really happen in the Netherlands, but it does happen in England, because in England you have this massive collapse of the peasantry and this proletarianization, to use a Marxist term, this massive influx of wage labor into the labor market, at the same time that you have this massive influx of money into the market, seeking investment, seeking to become more money. So, so England then becomes the world empire. And then it stays the world empire until World War I. And between World War I and World War II, it loses that status. And all the other European empires are really sort of clients of the British Empire. They're not necessarily always friendly with it, but capitalism is in large part cooperation through competition, right? You're cooperating with your competitors even when you're at odds with them, because in that process of competition, you're generating a social result that transcends either of your interests. It's the invisible hand. So that's, so Britain, and its client empires, the French, and so on, they lose their way of managing the world market between World War I and World War II. That collapses, and the United States takes over. But is that the end of the British Empire, or is that the transfer of the supremacy of the existing, power holders from an unstable, eroding base of operations into a far more stable and powerful base of operations, namely a continental republic with essentially endless resources that is effectively invulnerable to military assault, save from within, civil war. As Lincoln said, if as a nation of free men, we will live forever or die by suicide. Right. And, and I know you don't like Lincoln, but, that's true. That's true. The only way the United States could be conquered would be if it was divided against itself, again,
good thing that's not happening.
So, or, well, the methods of war are always evolving. So who knows? But basically my point is I see a lot more continuity in that transition from the Dutch to the English to the American Empire than I see discontinuity. And the fall of England, as much as it was a fall, wasn't really a fall of England. It was a fall of the common people of England from a certain position, that they enjoyed to some extent, insulation from the intensity of, the competitive environment of the world market that they, that the wealthy people in England were able to really capitalize on. But did it come to an end? I don't know. I mean, look, I don't look at it. I don't really look at it in terms of there's all these competing powers and each one's trying to become the dominant power. Maybe people do think about it that way. I don't know. But in any case, in that competition with each other, and they certainly are competing with each other, and they're both commercially, diplomatically, militarily, in that competition, despite whatever their intentions may be, whether they're actually just trying to secure the best environment to do business, or whether there's other crazier motives involved or whatever, Putin's, 10,000 years of Russian history or whatever, not 10,000, but you know what I mean? That whole thing where it's it goes back to the, the Magyars and whatever. I don't really think that that's what it's about. I think what it's about is the world market and the financial system that is sort of this octopus that has kind of whose tentacles have kind of slithered into every crevice of the world market and integrated them into its internal operations. And I say obviously it's not one thing. It's a lot of different things interacting with each other, but they're all more or less on the same, they're all operating, let's be clear, as we were discussing earlier, on the basis of the dollar system, on the basis of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, I know there's a tendency to see the Federal Reserve as the ultimate sort of coagulation of this sort of malevolent rule or whatever. And, it's certainly a core element of this whole system, but I don't think it's necessarily just about that institution. I think it's really more about everything that plugs into it and that uses it, and that keeps their money safe through U.S. Treasury bills.
Yep.
And that ensures that their money can go further than that elsewhere by means of the dollar system. At least that's what they're trying to do. Now, is that the best way to do it? Who knows? But that's certainly what they think they're doing. So all this military conflict, diplomatic tensions, economic competition between nations, and so on, I really see it as more reinforcing what already exists than undermining it. What is
Mm.
being undermined is the present way in which the United States organizes its domestic politics on the basis of its position in the world market, which is, essentially leveraging this advantage to, what it's done for since the New Deal period, leveraging its advantage on the world market to create a very large cushion that essentially insulates it from internal strife on the basis of primarily economic conflict, right? So buying off the workers, as I was saying,
Hmm.
and a big part of that was integrating the unions into the state, into the operations of the state, as well as big business. So the unions, the big business, all of it got integrated together into that thing. But that's not necessarily a sustainable thing. That could fall apart. I mean, it kind of already has fallen apart and then been put back together a few times, since then. Um, but what we really have now is we're on the brink of another change. Now, will that change be a collapse of US supremacy, the rise of a new power, maybe a world war, maybe the collapse of the dollar system? It could be any of those things. I'm skeptical of that just because I think it would be, I don't know what could lead to that. I don't really think that there's really much of a precedent to draw upon that is meaningful. Like if we're going to look at like Rome wasn't anything like what we are. Rome was a military, it was a slave empire. It was
Hmm.
based on extracting resources from its slave, but from its clients that were essentially reduced to slavery, and also literally directly enslaving the people that it conquered that were not willing to submit to being clients. So, it was much more, empire in that pattern, that old pattern that kind of reaches its pinnacle with Rome in a lot of ways. It doesn't end with Rome, but it in some ways it reaches its pinnacle with Rome. It obviously has some continuity with what we have now in some ways, but it's really in a fundamental way a different kind of thing. It's based on a very different kind of social existence, fun, kind of different baseline. And so I'm wary of those sorts of analogies being taken too far. And I also think, you know I think that the conflict and the strife tends to reinforce things as they are, with the caveat that things as they are in a constant state of flux. But the flux isn't just random. It's a kind of a process of creative destruction, as I think Joseph Schumpeter
Hmm.
coined that term. You know, yes, it has destructive consequences, both in human terms, in economic terms, in political terms, whatever. Um, and it has creative, constructive, positive consequences as well. The problem is that it's not that capitalism is horrible, evil, destructive, monstrous, whatever. The problem is that it's both of those things, is that it's good and bad in profound ways at the same time. And that those things are so deeply interconnected with each other that you can't like separate out the bad without without essentially creating more bad, you
Right,
know.
right.
So that's kind of my take on the whole thing. I know that's not necessarily a satisfying perspective. It's just my sense of it, but I do think, my concern is, if it's possible, I would like to see a revival of a working class politics in the United States. Now, does that take the form of Marxism or socialism in an old fashioned sense? I don't know. Maybe not. I certainly think there's a reason to consider that. But in any case, it doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is that the we have a whole society of people that have to work together on a day-to-day basis. And I don't just mean the people you directly work with in your, by your employer, but your customers just as much as your coworkers and your suppliers and your financiers and your government, throw the government in there for maybe to some extent. But all of these things have to keep working together in some way in order for everything to work, and
Hmm.
any major fault in the system, the ports shut down because of a strike, for example, or a hurricane knocks out some significant infrastructure, or there's a war that obstructs global trade or whatever. There's an oil shortage because of producers tampering with the supply, or withholding supply, or something like any of these sorts of things. Any of these interruptions in this flow of commerce can lead to devastating consequences, or at least very adverse consequences. And people have to work together day to day at all levels of society on a kind of universal scale in order to keep this thing going. And the way they do that is both through outright cooperation, like you have to cooperate with your coworkers or you're going to lose your job, and competition that coordinates cooperation indirectly, through the price mechanism and so on. And, that is a profound thing that I don't think that people really have a great sense of, because as much as we talk about capitalism or free trade or free enterprise, we still think of it in terms of like, I'm an owner of my business. And, my dad, my brother are small business owners. Like, I'm not anti-small business, but there's only so many industries where it's viable. And most people are not in a position to enter those industries as producers. And those that are tend to fail when they do so. And, new industries do spring up, but those that are significant tend to become massive industries pretty quickly. In fact, in some cases, you can't even begin without some massive injection of capital that will sort of dispossess you, even if you're a formal owner. You may get rich, but what do you control? So the whole thing is sort of far more integrated than I think we really tend to let on with the way we think about things, or the way then we tend to kind of reflect in the way we think about these things. And the politicians and the political parties are the worst of that, because they are literally like the most behind the curve of everyone, because they're like they're sweeping up the least common denominator of everything. They're going for that least common denominator, whether that's the state should effectively control everything, the bureaucrats should be in charge and be the ones making all the decisions, and that's both the bureaucrats in the state and the bureaucrats in private enterprise, in the corporations. And then there's the sort of Republican sort of entrepreneurial spirit, which is, I think, more admirable and more sympathetic in a lot of ways from my standpoint. But it's also more, I don't know, I feel like it's a little bit more naive in some ways, as not that the Democrats are like right, but there's like a kind of cold-hearted pragmatism to their bureaucratic mentality, where it's like, well, free speech is bad because it just creates all these problems in society. That's like what they're saying now.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, but that's for society to solve,
Yep.
But the thing is, if society is not solving those problems for itself, then the politicians are going to be the ones doing it. And they're not going to be doing it in the sense of actually solving the problems. They're going to be making the problems sustainable, or at least that's what they think they're doing. They're probably not successfully doing that. It might be sustainable for a little while. And so that brings us back to Trump, which is that, Trump, I don't have any illusions that he's going to like do anything great. At most he might establish, and I think he already kind of has to some extent with his first administration, establish something of a new pattern for U.S. leadership in the coming decade or decades. Will it be kind of more successful and dynamic replacement than what we're kind of doing now? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe not. I don't know. I have no idea. I really don't care about that. What's going to happen is going to happen. And I don't really think it depends on what the politicians do, not even the president of the United States. I think it has way more to do with what everyone is doing. And, the politicians may have a more substantial role than most people in some sense, and the parties and so on. But I think it's a much more complex thing. And so I think what I'm concerned with is the people that make up society, and the people that, no disrespect intended to anyone, but the people that work for a living, that are part of this thing, not people that are dependents, but people that are workers, whether they're self-employed or employees or whatever, or even business owners, in some sense, they're all part of this thing. And so when are we going to start taking it seriously and start really thinking about what it is and not what, not what it appears through the lens of like the 17th and 18th century,
Yep.
So that was the conversation in the 19th century, or at least that was what the socialists were trying to do. They were trying to think that through. And granted, there were a lot of bad ideas, confused ideas, mistaken ideas in the socialist movement. It was not like there was one idea that everyone agreed on that was a good idea. And even the good ideas not everyone agreed on, and where people tended to agree were not necessarily good ideas. Marxism wasn't so much like an idea unto itself in that sense as it was a way of criticizing what the ideas that were circulating were, in terms of what was actually happening in the world, namely this organization of the working class, self-organization of working people on a large scale, a massive scale, a scale that quite nearly brought the world to the brink of a European revolution, which at the time would have been a worldwide revolution. That revolution didn't happen. It failed. It was stillborn. It was strangled in the cradle, so to speak. And the Russian Revolution was just the abortive remainder of it that didn't quite die, but what was kind of deformed in the process of its abortion. So that's what people think it is. I would like to clarify that. I don't know if trying to clarify this history is actually going to do anything, but I really do think people need to think about it and to really consider it, because we're still chewing on it, whether we know it or not. And so I know I've been monologuing. Let me just wrap up. So I appreciate your patience with me.
Oh no, this is fascinating. I love, this is what you do. For everyone who is not aware of Reed, like this is what he does, and it's awesome. So I just like to let you run.
I go on and on and on. But yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I think I like what Trump represents at the very least because of what he represents to the people that are not like necessarily like the crazed hyper Trump people that will,
right.
I don't know how many people there are really like that. I think a lot of his supporters are a little bit more circumspect than that. And I think he does have a lot of supporters who they do like him in spite of him, and they're supporting him in spite of him, or at least in spite of what they think about him. Because it's not just that he represents like change. There is that. But, like Obama was that, and that didn't really amount to anything. And it's not just that he is trying to shift the kind of footing of the US in terms of its way of orienting itself in the world market and orienting itself as like the global superpower, although he is doing that. It's more about how he's reconfiguring the electorate and the way he's embodying this crisis of both political parties that really kind of kicked off in 2016. Now, I don't think that crisis leads to a positive development in either of those parties, ultimately. I think whatever happens, it's going to just end up being a new version of the same kind of thing that we had before, more or less.
Yep.
But for what it's worth, he is getting a whole lot of people that were politically disenfranchised, not de jure, but de facto, essentially. They felt like nobody represented them for quite some time. Working people that are absolutely fed up with the fact that their wages, their real wages, the cost of living has skyrocketed, and their wages have not kept up and have stagnated or fallen in real terms. That obviously the thing about immigration is a reflection of that. What they're really upset about is not the immigration. It's the influx in the labor market that they see is driving down wages. Now, whether or not that's a correct analysis doesn't really matter. And the crime stuff is auxiliary to that, even though it kind of tends to become more at the forefront of the mainstream media. That's really not the concern. The concern is more so, I think, about flooding the labor market with cheap labor. That's going to drive down wages. That's going to lead to capital flight, not necessarily through, outsourcing, but, relocation within the country, if not outsourcing. And, I mean, people, there's been a generation of people whose children have been unemployed, who have become addicted to opioids, who have, essentially vegetated and become, these sort of, their lives have essentially become nothing. They've become nothing, and they've seen this happen to their children or their brothers and sisters or their friends, and obviously this is driving people insane, and they really want to announce their discontent with this whole thing. And Trump is the only thing that has come along in a very long time that has looked anything like that, the middle finger to the status quo, so to speak.
I think that's it, man. I think it is that he is perceived as, number one, a strong man, which people always want, like from a tribal perspective. Somebody's going to represent them in the halls of power, and also an outsider, like somebody who's like, he's not part of that political system. He was not a governor or a senator. It didn't come up that way. Came up through business.
He's a businessman. He knows business. He's a negotiator.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of people rally behind him just for that reason. It is a big middle finger to people. I think he had more power with that narrative in 2016, frankly. I think that was, drain the swamp, that whole marketing ploy, like that really resonated with people. I think he's lost some support because of his first term, particularly amongst the more right-wing elements. You called out sort of, I think some group he scooped up happened to be some Democratic rejects, right? So we're talking about the deplorables, these blue collar workers, whether it's coal or oil or some sort of blue collar manufacturing. Like, he was sort of the champion for those people, and the Democrats have sort of pivoted to become the party of Wall Street and corporatism. And I think that it's been a very weird inversion that I've seen in those dynamics.
I mean, he's pulled in a lot of rank and file union support, even I would say with the union support in terms of the rank and file, more so now than 2016, as far as I can tell.
Oh, really?
At least it's more prominent. And in that sense, even the union leadership in certain unions has been more reluctant to throw their support. I mean, you have the Teamsters refusing to endorse the Democrats. You have, various, there are, some union locals are endorsing Trump and so on. It's not just the unions either. The Black population, there's been a significant shift towards Trump this time around, much more so than either of his previous elections. And, Arab Americans, maybe that has something to do with the war, but he has a lot of support from Hispanics, Latin Americans, a lot, immigrants as well as naturalized first generation immigrants, as well as established citizens of Hispanic ancestry and so on. I think that you're right that he has probably lost some of the right-wing support that he relied upon in the first two elections, especially the first one. But I think he's also absorbed a lot of support that the Democrats have been shedding or been unable to keep. And is that durable? Well, I don't know. Probably not. I mean, I don't think J.D. Vance or Vivek Ramaswamy or Donald Trump Jr., I don't think any of these people are really poised to replace him.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think this is kind of like the end of it. Like, whatever Trumpism is, we got one more election cycle in front of us, and then the Republican Party is going to have to evolve into something else.
I think it might remain on this path, but in a less sort of intense way than it is with Trump, if you will, like a more domesticated way.
Yeah.
I think they'll probably keep some of the trappings of Trumpism, but it will be reined in. It'll be reined in a way that they can't really rein him in. They just can't.
Yep. Agreed.
And then I think the Democrats will probably adapt, and they'll probably have the equivalent of their Bill Clinton to his Ronald Reagan. Whatever that looks like. I mean, who knows? But I don't know. At the end of the day, I don't think the Trump thing changes much. Even the things that I find encouraging about it, it's more just that, like, it demonstrates something, that there is this immense kind of well of discontent that can be catalyzed and can be sort of it can be the basis for something. Now, what it is now is not really the basis of anything really meaningful, in my opinion. But, in 8 years from now, 12 years from now, when the shock of the Trump phenomenon has sort of worn away and things maybe things get better for a while, maybe they don't. But at a certain point, we're going to look back on it and say, what was that all about? Like,
For sure.
and, I hope it doesn't get to the point where we're looking back on Trump and we just, that was wild, huh? Like, I would like to think that, something much more than what that was could happen as well. But, you can't just make something like that happen. No one can make that happen. That's something that happens, because of kind of elemental forces in society that you can't really consciously control. They just sort of move through people and move through these massive movements of human beings and machinery and resources and energy, flowing across the globe. It's I think if we could endow that with the kind of conscious direction that we endow our own actions with as individuals, that would be profound. But what would that mean? It wouldn't mean a government deciding how everything operates and just and imposing something on everyone. That would obviously not work. But is it just a matter of people fighting with each other for the scraps and that friction generated by their conflict among one another being the force that moves things forward? Or could it be more than that? Like, I don't know. But I think, history has some interesting, it has examples, not necessarily, it has a lot of examples of what not to do. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of examples of what to do, but it does have things to think about that we don't think about anymore, And it's not just a matter of saying that was right or that was wrong, but what was that and why did that happen? And was there more to it than it actually ended up being,
Yeah, I completely agree. And hey, man, I'm up against a hard stop. I could keep going.
I appreciate you entertaining me.
No, I could keep going forever. I consider you to be a brilliant mind, somebody who's really, deep in the history, understands current events, and also means well, right? Which is a Venn diagram that doesn't always have all the circles overlapping.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate your perspective. Thanks for educating me. I really appreciate the chat today. And man, be very exciting to see what happens in the next few weeks. Hopefully America doesn't rip apart.
Hopefully.
But yeah, well, I'm glad that you're focused on what this moment means and how we could work together to make things better, man. That's really the entire ethos of this podcast, man. So I really appreciate your time.
Hey, man, I love talking to you. Thank you for having me. I look forward to talking again.
Yes, sir. Have a good one.